Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our second session on 4D vision. We're looking at 3D scene understanding in time, in presumably dynamic scenes or more complex scenes. My name is Anguelova at Google Research and Robotics at Google. And I have had the pleasure to organize this workshop with Vincent Kasser from Waymo, Jürgen Sturm from X, and Noah Snavely and Rahul Sukhtankar from Google Research. Just a bit of logistics. We'll have our second panel. We'll have a second set of our invited speakers talk first, and then we'll have panel discussions with Q&A, and then Q&A over the spotlights. Please participate in the discussion via the Q&A chat, and we'll try to ask your questions in the panel discussions for the speakers and authors. I also want to remind you that the sessions will be recorded, so please mute yourself or remove your video if you don't want to be recorded. Here are our invited speakers and panelists. And in the second session, we will have Tom Funkhouser, Xiaolong Wang, and Drago Anguelov. And our first speaker is Tom Funkhouser. Tom is a professor in the computer science department at Princeton University and also a research scientist at Google. Tom has published numerous papers, and he has had many awards. Among some of the honors and awards are the ACM SIGGRAPH Computer Graphics Achievement Award, Sloan Foundation Fellowship, and NSF Career Award. Tom, over to you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak. It's quite an honor. So yeah, I'll be talking about spatial action maps. It's going to be a pretty specific talk because it's a short time. The goal of what I'm going to describe, if I can go to the next slide, is to train robots to perform mobile manipulation tasks. So tasks where the goal is to do a sequence of operations at specific locations. Bin picking is an example of this, where the robot has to go and perform certain grasping actions at a sequence of locations. And the object collection task on the right is similar to that, where the robot has to navigate to different locations for the goal of collecting all the objects into a receptacle. To keep things very specific, I'm going to focus on a specific type of mobile manipulation task where the system is trained with deep reinforcement learning. So, and I'm going to even go more specific than that and say I'm going to focus on tasks where it's deep reinforcement learning where the state is represented by a map or an image. In this case, the little red box on the left where it says state is an overhead view of a bin that a robot arm might see as there's the state of the world when they're deciding where next to grasp. Of course, this does not cover all robotic actions in the world. Certainly not ones that create a model and then do planning based on that model and so on and so forth. But it does cover a lot of cases where you have to do a sequences of do that there, and where a state can be represented by pixels, where each pixel is representing a location in space. Okay, and in particular in this talk, I'm going to focus on what is the representation of actions we should use in that setting. It's going to turn out that the parameterization of actions really affects the sample efficiency of training and the ability of an agent to learn. So I'm going to look at that. Okay, so I'll start with some very high-level thoughts about how to choose an action representation, and then I'll talk about a specific proposal and show some experiments with it. So my high-level thoughts are that the deep neural network takes in an input state, and again, in this case, it's going to be an image, and it outputs a selection of an action. And so we want the deep neural network to be asked to produce a function that's easy for it to learn. Of course, we think of neural networks as these amazing function approximators that can learn any kind of function given enough data. But that's actually not really true. I think there's certain things that they're very good at, and things that they're not so good at. And so it's really important to pick an action representation for which makes in the case of where the deep neural network is good. So what are they good at? So they're excellent at learning filters that light up pixels where there are certain patterns. So if you have a fully convolutional network and you're doing semantic segmentation, recognizing where the eyes of a cat are, they're really, really good at that. They can learn those filters. And they're really good at combining features of local patterns into classifiers that tell what kind of image this is. But they're bad at abstracting parameters of things unrelated to the input as a function. So for a classic example of that is if I have a one-hot image where there's one white pixel and a bunch of black pixels, can I predict the XY of that white pixel? They're just notoriously bad at that simple task. And it's because the concept of XY is kind of abstract relative to the input. And that's relevant in this case of mobile manipulation because most systems that do mobile manipulation, if we just looked at navigation, for example, where you have to take a sequence of steps to perform some sort of navigation task, they almost all use steering commands, which are of the form, move forward by a certain amount, turn right by a certain angle, strafe right, so on and so forth. And so they're going from an input state, which is often an image, like in this case, in the Saurabh Gupta paper, there's this really elegant way of differentiably learning a map of the world, but then the differentiable planner, which is the second part of the system, goes from that map to abstract actions. In this case, it's a classifier of which of these actions to run. And I'm going to argue that another alternative method is to learn what I'm going to call spatial action maps, where you go from a state to a dense set of possible actions that are pixel to pixel aligned with the input state, where the meaning of each pixel is do this particular action at that particular location. So each ij of the spatial action map represents a physical location in space aligned with a map. And the value in that is how good is it to do this particular action there. And this can be learned with a fully convolutional network and falls into that category of recognizing local patterns in maps. Okay, and so just to contrast that with the traditional approach, which almost everybody uses, again, it's a direct pixel-to-pixel matching from state to action. You're simultaneously predicting the value of moving to all locations in space. And so you can have much more complex actions and longer range actions than you would if you had to string together a sequence of short, move forward by an inch, move forward by an inch, move forward by an inch. And so that makes the learning much more direct and simpler. Okay, so we're gonna describe a specific project that investigates this idea. It was done by an intern at Google, Jimmy Wu, who's also a PhD student at Princeton, along with some collaborators from Google, Princeton, and Columbia. It appeared at RSS like a month or two ago. Okay, so in that paper, the focus is on a task where robots have to push objects into receptacles, motivated by cases where you're cleaning up leaves or cleaning up trash or things like that. And so there's a robot that moves through the environment. All it can do is navigate. And there are objects, and the goal is for the robot to push them all into the receptacle. So here's an example of the robot in action, trying to push them into the receptacle. So that's the task that we're trying to learn. And the way we're going to do that, we're going to train in simulation. So the picture on the left is a picture of our simulation environment. We're going to have an environment that is going to simulate a state by reconstructing the environment based on what has been seen so far with a virtual camera, and then choose a sequence of actions that through deep reinforcement learning are going to give us the best expected reward in the future. So just real quickly going into the details of that, our state is built up by having a virtual RGBD camera that over time accumulates an expectation of where obstacles are and what the environment is. And then it gives the deep neural network as input a state that is aligned with the robot view and clipped to a reasonable horizon of how far it can see. So it's not, it doesn't get to see the entire world, but just is choosing some area around it. And then it has to choose an action, and the action space that it chooses is, again, for every pixel in space, it predicts the Q value of performing an action that is follow the shortest path through the unoccupied space of your current estimate of the occupancy map. So that's our particular action that we're using. And again, so on the right shows all these shortest paths. So if the robot is kind of where all those blue lines come together, then this is showing the set of actions that are possible. And the deep neural network is going to predict a Q value for each of those possible actions. And so in comparison to steering commands, this is quite different. Like, you're not just taking a step along a particular direction, but you can take pretty complex actions. You can follow the shortest path, for example, through your estimate of the world. And this is a little bit orthogonal to the idea of spatial action maps. I think it's an advantage that you get from spatial action maps that you can even do this. But it's another interesting thing is that it's a way to combine simulation and deep neural networks. Which, you know, there's like just certain things that we know about the world that would be nice to use in a system that's using deep networks. And this is one way to do that, which is have your actions be the result of a simulation. Anyway, and then we provide a reward that's just quite simple. It's just you get a full reward for getting an object into the receptacle, and then partial rewards for moving objects closer, and you have a penalty for collisions. Okay, and so then we train that with a traditional DQN kind of setup where we're doing value iteration with double DQN, with a replay buffer and epsilon greedy sampling and so on and so forth, all standard stuff. So we train the agents in a variety of different environments that range from fairly simple ones, like the ones on the left that are kind of small and have no obstacles, to the ones on the right, which are large and have like a serious barrier that separates two ends. You have to kind of go through the hole in order to get from one side to the other. And we investigate how different action representations affect the quality of the learning. So we train multiple policies for each of our test cases, and then we run those policies multiple times and average their results and produce their standard deviations to evaluate our method. And the kinds of metrics we're going to use for success are what's the number of blocks that the agent is able to push in the receptacle at the end of each episode, or as a function of distance, and then also what is the sampling efficiency of the training. So here's some examples of agents after they've been trained in these different environments using the spatial action map. So this is the kind of behavior that you should expect. Okay, and again, all it can do is move around. It has to learn on its own to like go around the yellow blocks and push them back to the receptacle. No one told it to do that. Okay, and so then if we compare using a steering representation in exactly the same setup as ours versus spatial action maps, the numbers here are the number of objects that are pushed into a receptacle per episode. The short version of this is that it's very hard to train with a sequence of short steering commands. The paths that you need to take are kind of complicated, and looking at a local view, it's hard to know where you need to take one small step. But if you get to look at the endpoint and then reason with trajectories that are shortest paths, then you can very quickly understand what you need to do. So it's a huge, huge difference. If we looked at in-between methods, so ours is on the left and steering commands on the right. If we just limit ours to take short steps, it's still significantly better than steering commands. And if we limit it to not follow shortest paths, but only take straight paths, it's still significantly better. So the value is coming from the spatial action maps, not from the fact that we follow these shortest paths or anything like that. If we look at a plot of how effectively the agent's able to do the task, this is the horizontal axis here is how far the distance has traveled within an episode. And the vertical axis is the number of blocks it's pushed into the receptacle. So basically it just does the task much more quickly and effectively with the spatial action maps than with steering commands. And then if we look at how sample efficient the training is, which is a different thing, we see that the spatial action maps enable learning much more quickly than the steering commands. And I guess it's possible that the red curve, which is still going up, could have reached a higher value if we had let it kept training, but we didn't follow that to the end. Anyway, so then we take the robots that we train in simulation, and without any further fine tuning or any further training, just apply the sim to real in real settings. So this is a very simple, short clip of a robot pushing something in. And it's nice to see emerging behaviors that make sense coming out of this. This is, again, a very short clip where the robot basically learns to push objects up against walls, and then it learns to sweep objects that are against walls into the receptacle. And so again, this is just an emerging behavior that we did not tell it to do or anything, but basically at the beginning of the episodes, it kind of crisscrosses through the center, pushing things up against the wall. And then when it sees things are up against the wall, it goes and sweeps them into the receptacle, which is kind of cool. And then it also learns kind of complex interactions. Like we're here, the objects get stuck in the corner, and it's kind of able to take these little actions and get them around the corner into the receptacle. Anyway, and again, it would be kind of hard to handcraft a policy that would do something like that. So to summarize, I describe spatial action maps where it's a representation of actions that are suitable for a case where you do that there is the kind of sequence of operations you're going to do in your system, and that your state, it can be represented in an image pixel aligned with the action map. And the reason that we do that is that that action representation is well targeted for the strength of deep networks, which is recognizing local patterns. And if we combine it with giving channels that are the result of simulations like shortest paths, then the deep network can make choices about how to combine what was known by the simulation with the local patterns that it sees, like recognizing blocks, for example, to try to choose which is the next thing that's going to be most useful in its reinforcement learning. Great. To be clear, this kind of approach is not applicable everywhere. It's applicable only in cases where actions can be represented by locations on a map. And so previously, prior to the topic that I just described, we had a paper where we used the same idea to represent robot grasps in a pick and place system, where the blue squares on the right are Q values of picking at particular orientations and positions. And so the same idea applies to pick and place, but of course it can't apply to all possible problems in robotics. And then it's also applicable only when the actions, when you represent them as do this action at this location, can be executed by a planner with motor control based on that input. So ultimately, we have to give voltages to the robot arm, or we have to give commands that move the wheels of the small robot. And so in both of the cases that I've investigated, we can go from do that there to the actual inverse kinetics that control the robot arm, or to the commands that move the robot. And so it's only this type of approach is only applicable where that's possible. In future work, it would be interesting to look at what kinds of other tasks can be done with spatial action maps. I think it's a really good idea, like much better than, like compared to steering commands. I feel like everybody should just stop using steering commands. And so there are other people who have very recently looked at using spatial action maps for navigation, but what else could they be used for? And what could they use for self-driving cars? Could they be used for, what other kinds of things could they be used for? I do think they're the way to go. So anyway, I want to thank my co-authors, in particular Jimmy Wu, who really did all the work, and Johnny Lee from Google Brain, and Alberto Rodriguez from MIT, and then some collaborators from Princeton. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you, Tom, for the great talk. Looking forward to the panel later. So to the audience, again, the reminder that we'll have questions later, so you can already add them to the Q&A as we move along. But now to our next speaker, Xiaolong Wang, who is an assistant professor at UC San Diego in the ECE department. He holds a PhD in robotics from Carnegie Mellon University and was a postdoctoral fellow at UC Berkeley. His research interests include self-supervised learning, video understanding, and common sense reasoning. Welcome, Xiaolong.
Thanks for the introduction. So today I'm going to talk about self-supervised learning for correspondence and 3D reconstruction in time. So in these talks, we are going to focus on exploring the continuity in videos and use the continuity to first learn visual correspondence and then perform 3D reconstruction of the object using the correspondence in a self-supervised manner. So let's look at this video of a dog jumping into the water. Because we know that the video is continuous, the dog in the first frame should also appear in another frame within a short time. So even the dog disappears in the middle, it appears again immediately. So the fact that the objects continue to exist in a short time, in psychology, it is called object permanence. This can actually be a constraint telling us that there are pixels corresponding to each other over all these frames. So in these talks, I will first talk about how to learn correspondence from videos without using any human supervision. And finding the correspondence means finding where each pixel or patch goes from one image to another. I will then introduce how to utilize this correspondence to improve 3D reconstruction results for videos in the wild with test time self-supervised adaptation. Here is a result from using our correspondence to help improving a vivid 3D bird reconstruction from a video. So I will first talk about our work on learning correspondence from the cycle consistency of time. So our goal here is to learn visual correspondence without using any human supervision, without labels. A range of prior work has used temporal structure in videos to obtain self-supervision for learning visual representations. This includes predicting color in time, predicting the pixel in time, and predicting the arrow of time. Most related to us is one of our previous work that using tracking to learn representations that captures visual similarity. For example, using of the shelf trackers, we can provide examples for visual metric learning. We can force the legwork to learn to have similar representations for these two patches from the same track, and the representation should also be different from other random patches from other videos. So similar kinds of metric learning is also very popular right now, which is called contrastive learning. So the problem of this method is that tracking is actually very difficult. So this work ends up being limited by the weakness of the shelf tools they rely on. So we have seen that learning features requires a good tracker to provide data for learning, but the tracker requires good features for finding the correspondences. Let's learn them both jointly. Suppose we have a deep legwork tracker F. Given the patch in the last frame, we first perform tracking in time with the legwork F, but where can we find the supervision to train such a legwork? Given the tracking result in the first frame, we apply the same tracker to perform forward tracking back to the future. The inconsistency between the initial patch and the final tracking result provides an error for supervision. We can then propagate the error along the cycle to improve our representation and tracker F. Besides the long cycles, we have also designed different lengths of cycles. For example, shorter cycles provide easier tasks, which support learning at the beginning of training. Sometimes correspondence is impossible due to occlusions. We also design cycles that can skip frames to address this issue. So during training time, we combine all kinds of cycles together. So here is a visualization of one cycle during different iterations of training. We can see that as the cycle becomes more and more consistent, the tracking result gets better and better and better. At test time, we only keep the learned representations, using it to measure the correspondence with nearest neighbors. Given the 2 frames in the video, we first extract features for each frame. We then compute the similarity between every pair of pixels across feature maps. So here is an example of computing the similarity between 1 pixel in time t-1 and all the pixels in time t. We select the most similar pair as the correspondence, and given any labels in time t-1, we can then propagate the labels to the next frames according to the correspondence. So here is an example of tracking object masks, giving the labels in the first frame. So we didn't do any fine-tuning using the labels in the Davis dataset. We just use our representation to perform nearest neighbors tracking. Here is an example of pose tracking. Tracking pose key point here is actually a much harder task because there are only a few of them, and we need to track exactly where the key point goes. And again, we didn't use any annotations for training the tracker. So we evaluate the accuracy of pose comparing to the ground truth. Our method outperforms previous methods, including the self-supervised learning with video collaboration. To visualize that if we really learn good dense correspondence, we can actually paint the first frame with a rainbow texture, like some random strips, and then propagate this texture to the following frames like this. Although the pose of the dog changes a lot, we can still keep tracking the eyes of the dog. So remember this random strip texture example. It will be very helpful for our following work on 3D object reconstruction. So in this following work, I want to talk about how can we use this kind of correspondence in time to help us to perform online adaptation for consistent mesh reconstruction in the wild. So in this work, our goal is to perform 3D reconstruction of non-rigid objects in the wild in the lecture video. For example, reconstructing the 3D mesh of a flying bird. Recent work has successfully trained models for single view 3D reconstruction, given a group of training images that are annotated with key points. However, when we try to apply the trained image model to a testing video, the reconstructed object shows discontinuous shape and flicking camera predictions. So this is a really hard problem because when you try to reconstruct an object with a small change in the input image, you can either change the object shape or you can change the estimated camera. And it's usually unclear what you need to change. There is also a large domain gap between the images and videos. Most videos contain some low quality frames or with small foreground objects. There are also videos with lighting variance or clutter background. So to solve this domain gap problem, our solution, one solution is to annotate bird videos as many as possible so that we can retrain the model to cover these domains. However, using human annotations here is time-consuming and not realistic. So instead of using human annotations to solve this adaptation problem, our work here is actually inspired by one of our recent work on test time training with self-supervision. Since that in self-supervised learning, we can always have the labels for free. So we can even apply it during test time during we apply this model in the video. So in this paper, in this framework, it performs joint training of image classification and rotation prediction self-supervised tasks during training time. During the test time, given an image as input, the legwork is fine-tuned with only the self-supervised task to make the feature to adapt to the input image. And since the feature is shared across the classification task, so the adaptation makes it improve the classification task as well. So following the same spirit, we also want to perform self-supervised learning during testing to improve 3D reconstruction in our work. So we propose to perform online adaptation in a test video. We first train a single view reconstruction legwork using a group of annotated images like previous methods. During testing, we fine-tune the legwork to make it continuously adapt to a single video that the legwork is tested on. To perform the adaptation, we need to figure out an effective self-supervised objectives that can improve the legwork over time. The key idea here is to use the temporal consistency to construct the self-supervised tasks. So there are three important components we find that are the keys for consistent 3D mesh reconstruction. If we can keep these three components consistent over time, then we can have wonderful results. The first one is the shape. We need to keep the overall basic shape consistent across the whole video, but at the same time, we also allow some changes of the shape continuously over time. The second one is the texture flow map. So no matter how the shape and viewpoint of the object changes, the texture flow from the 2D image space to the UV space should be the same as always. The last one is the most important one here. It is the part consistency. So we should still find the correspondence between the same part across time. I will first introduce how to enforce the shape consistency. So instead of predicting the coordinates of the raw pick vertices, we decompose it as shape basis combination and the offset with respect to it. So the shape bases here are the shapes clustered with k-means. So in here, we have 8 shape bases. The combination of bases reveals the identity of an instance. So we use this beta to compute the weighted average of these shape bases as the base for the current shape. So it can be an ordinary bird, a flying bird, or a duck. And we enforce the prediction of the coefficients that is used to combine the shape bases to be consistent over time. That is, we assume the identity or the style of this instance does not change over time, but we still allow small changes. So the delta V here can still change a little bit across time. We also explore such invariance over the UV space, which is independent to the shape deformation and the camera view. So we can enforce the RGB textures or a painting strip or parts projected on the UV map to be consistent over different frames. So let's focus on the random parts here and see how they can enforce better reconstruction. First of all, how do we even obtain this part? Because we are trying to only focusing on a single video. This part does not have to be semantically meaningful. So what we do here, it is just drawing random strips on top of the first frame in the video. So this is an example of we drawing random strips on top of the bird in the first frame of the video. The strips can then be propagated to the rest of the videos using a pixel tracker. For example, using our previous method to find dense correspondence from videos. After that, we map the individual parts to the UV space. By following a texture flow map from RGB to UV space, we can also map the parts to the part UV map. We then average all these part UV map inside the video to have a more reliable part map, because the correspondence between the parts and the UV coordinates should be consistent over time. So we can perform this averaging procedure. Using the same average video level map, video leveled part UV map, we can paste it back or warp it to different predicted shapes from different images and render back these colorful strips texture images. So we use the same part map and different shapes to perform rendering. We then apply a loss by comparing the rendered images against the original propagated strips in 2D space. We use this loss to backprop the error to fix and regularize the shape and the camera. Because the same part UV map needs to be used to render a continuously changing part image. So this involves the shape and the camera to have smooth changes. So the only changing part is the shape and the camera. So here is a first example comparing the results with and without our online adaptation method. We can see that even the bird is not moving, small changes in the image space will lead to large camera changes in baseline, while our method can produce stable outputs. Our texture flow maps here are also consistent over time. Here is another example of the bird. So if you can focus on the head of the bird, you can see our results is very accurately aligned with the input video. So here we show 3 different views of the same 3D reconstruction results. So below, again, is the online adaptation results, and above is the image-based results without the online adaptation. So you can again see our duck with online adaptation is smoothly changing over time, where the image-based method is jumping a lot. In this case, you can see the bird with online adaptation can eat continuously, while the baseline approach is just jumping a lot. So here is another result. When the head of the bird is moving a lot, you can see that when the bird is not moving, our 3D reconstruction is also staying very smoothly and still. The baseline with only image base will be flickering a lot, especially on the camera. Here's an example of a zebra, because we allow there to be small shape changes over time. So we can see the zebra actually is walking here, even though we did not do anything particularly to deal with the articulation of the mesh. And then finally, here is an extreme case where our model failed in the end, because the bird flying away, and it is even very hard to check. But our model in the bottom is still much better than the baseline. And in the end, we can see the post is still kind of correct comparing to the image, while the baseline image model have been failed in the middle. Okay, that's all of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Drago Anguelov, who is a principal scientist and head of research at Waymo. Drago joined Waymo in 2018 to lead the research team, which focuses on developing the state-of-the-art in autonomous driving using machine learning. He spent 8 years at Google working on 3D vision, and later leading a research team developing systems for Google Photos, which, among others, invented Inception, neural network architecture, and the SSD detector. Before Waymo, he led the 3D perception team at Zoox. Yeah, so all yours. Welcome.
Thank you, Vincent. Can you guys see the slides and myself? Everything good?
Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you guys for tuning in. I will talk a bit about recent work of Waymo on the topic of scene understanding for autonomous driving. For those that don't know, Waymo is Alphabet's self-driving company. We focus on two areas: moving people with our Waymo One service and moving goods through Waymo Via, which focuses on trucks and also delivery services. Waymo has been around since 2009, and since then we've driven over 20 million miles on public roads in autonomous mode in over 25 cities in the States. Let's talk about scene understanding. I will ground this in an example. This is downtown San Francisco. In order for us to safely navigate such environments, we need to understand quite well the complex scene around us, which includes, first of all, scene context in the form of things like traffic lights, road markings, signs, occlusions behind that bus on the left, if you look quite to the side. And of course, in self-driving, we're a complex multi-agent domain. There is a lot of interesting driver behaviors and pedestrian behaviors, which we need to navigate around and anticipate and predict their action. What is also interesting is that, of course, the actions of all the actors on the road are strongly predicated by the same strong semantic context of the road situation, road rules, and so on that we need to understand for ourselves as well. Where does scene understanding come from in self-driving? One way to think about self-driving is, of course, as a mapping from sensors, camera, lidar, radar, to controls, steering and acceleration. And in the past, there have been attempts to represent this with a deep neural net, in which case scene understanding happens implicitly somewhere inside this neural net in the layers and the learned parameters. Such approaches have been tried a long time ago. The seminal Alvin work learned to do lane following using deep neural net training in '89. And more recently, there have been more successes of these methods, but even though they perform quite well in more straightforward tasks, like the said lane following, they have not yet realized the generalizability and robustness that's necessary to handle the complex scenes of the kind I showed you. So, of course, it's great to train end-to-end, but it appears that so far, at least, we need more structure in the model. And we need to encode that to improve our ability to capture the gist of the scene and generalize. And so scene understanding the modular way becomes the question really of what should the modules of our system and their outputs be? And through designing these modules and outputs, we input important structure that should be helpful and help further understand and encode domain knowledge. In self-driving, the core modules, of course, most of you would know, perception, behavior prediction, and planning. Then the planning is responsible for making a certain set of decisions that then the controller executes on the car. In the systems of the leading self-driving companies, typically this structure captures certain properties of the domain that are important. And there are several common trends, such as going from millions to tens of millions of pixels and scans early in the pipeline to notion of objects, relationships, trajectories, attributes later in the pipeline when we make the decisions. And we typically go from an image view and perspective projection to a top-down view and Euclidean projection, which again tends to generalize better for the diversity of situations that you handle. However, one can try to dig deeper. That is a very high-level view. What are exactly these representations that are most beneficial for capturing the structure of our domain? Admittedly, it's a complex domain. And a lot is going on. First, I would say that in this talk, it's good to focus on perception and behavior prediction as the two core modules where most of this scene understanding happens. But even within them, there are core questions. For example, what should the PP be? What should be the outputs of perception? There are many options. A lot of these we know relatively well how to do, but which ones really matter? And it's a bit similar with behavior prediction. There's many ways to encode your estimates of future behavior by agents. Which ones really matter? And so in our field, we can switch a bit more from focusing on a specific task, or, well, in this case, a set of many specific tasks, to a more holistic system view of trying to understand which of these tasks really go together and are beneficial for truly performing well and with potentially less data, with more accuracy and safety in this environment. A good modular design embeds several properties. One is encodes important intuition about the domain. Two, it can introduce additional structure and intermediate outputs, which are amenable for supervision. These are quantities that people understand and either can label or, of course, can evaluate. And three, potentially, some of these outputs are also very amenable to capturing self-supervision constraints, which in our temporal domain are quite abundant and, again, improve the performance of the system. Overall, in this talk, I will demonstrate several recent investigations at Waymo that relate and shine light on some of these questions. And of course, it's a very rich area where more research is needed. There is a lot of options. I will start by talking about perception model and system called VIDAR, which is a camera and range image centric modeling framework where we couple reasoning about scene geometry, semantics, scene dynamics, and more. This is joint work with Anguelov, who is a co-organizer of this workshop, and her team, Ariel Gordon, as well as people from Waymo. And I want to talk a little bit about this work as an illustration of how thinking about several different outputs together may be preferable than tackling them separately. VIDAR is at its core a deep structure from motion framework. A lot of you here would know. Structure from motion is a way to estimate 3D geometry from correspondences across time in image sequences by exploiting motion parallax. The deep structure from motion variants typically learn models that allow you to warp images in time and allow you to apply these per pixel photometric losses as supervision, enforcing consistency constraints. In a little more detail, you have a couple of images. If you have a model that can estimate accurate depth for pixel in each image, which in our case at Waymo, since we have rich camera and LiDAR data, we can easily supervise with LiDAR well. That's one estimator. A second part is that from a pair of images, we can have a model that can estimate the post-transform or the ego motion of the vehicle, as well as the residual flow of any other objects that are independently moving in this environment. If we have such a model, now what we can do is we can start generating novel views and comparing our generated novel views to the actual views observed, in this case, pushing consistency constraints and self-supervising. I think you guys have seen enough work like this to motivate this approach. One thing I would say that is particular for our domain is, one, we have large-scale training data sets. We released quite a large data set of camera and LiDAR data that is suitable for this in the Waymo Open data set. And internally, we have yet orders of magnitude more such data. At Waymo, camera and LiDAR is really well co-aligned and timed. And so LiDAR supervision is great. While great, it's not perfect. There's still timing mismatches that are quite hard to avoid. LiDAR is a spinning sensor, so it captures the scene over time. Cameras also exhibit rolling shutter, so they also capture the scene over time. And there is inevitably some mismatch between these two. This is particularly illustrated in the black areas where in this image where the mismatch is the highest. In others, it's quite good. And we need to account for all of these effects because our vehicles move fast, and without accounting, we would incur significant displacements between LiDAR and camera and the objects at high speeds. And so we accurately take care of this, and we even share the library in the open data set to help others do so. Another thing we do is we train the model over several cameras simultaneously, which improves performance compared to training the model on a single camera. And the gains are potentially more than what we originally expected from this fact. What are applications of this wider setup? Again, to recapitulate, it's a great way to train very accurate geometric models, such as depth egomotion and object dynamics. But it's also quite helpful for a consistency modeling framework in which we can try to improve supervised semantics models further. This is an example of some of the modalities predicted by the model: depth, uncertainty in the depth, semantics, and we can have others. I would particularly like to highlight uncertainty estimation in the depth model. In regular examples like this, we expect our depth estimates to be quite accurate, which I think you can see a little bit in the images here. The uncertainty in yellow comes exactly in the places where you would expect it. These are edge discontinuities, and also the windows of the buildings, where the LiDAR readings are not that stable. They can go inside. There is areas, though, however, where uncertainty is really crucial. This is an example of driving at night, and on the left, you have the headlights, and on the right, you have a camera looking to the side, and there's darker. You can see that these models learn that we are quite uncertain in those areas. Also in this foggy, or if you have moisture on the lens situations, the model is quite uncertain anywhere, which is exactly what you would like. And this is another dark example here. So it's important when you have these depth estimation models to really be sure when you actually can rely on them. This is an example that can be quite helpful. This is a video of us driving through San Francisco, a sequence from the open data set. You can see in the second row is the depth estimated everywhere, crisp boundaries, a lot of clear structure. On the third row is the uncertainty estimation, and on the bottom is areas where uncertainty is higher than a certain threshold. You can see that big parts of the scene we still can estimate quite accurately. I will show a bit later how accurate actually this is. One artifact or product of these networks is also 3D flow. We can learn 3D flow as part of this wider model in a self-supervised fashion without any supervision. This on the right is an example where if you squint, you will see that each of these vehicles have slightly different color corresponding to their motion in the scene. Last but not least, such consistency frameworks across time are helpful for supervising semantic models. The insight here really is similar to the photometric loss, only in this case we have semantic label loss. We can take a prediction at time t, say, of where the vehicle pixels are, and we can synthesize a prediction at time t+1 accurately via the model and compare to actual prediction in force consistency for the model prediction semantic model at that time. This is helpful, especially for expensive types of data, such as semantic segmentation, where there is really a cost to getting a lot of examples, and this is a way to try to bootstrap your model further. So an example of this as applied to our models is that training segmentation and depth jointly does improve both a bit, which is a very nice result. A little bit more visual beauty in terms of visualizing the accuracy and quality of our model. This is depth estimated by a single frame. And then we toggle the camera view a little bit to show you how we can synthesize other views. And this is a more extreme version of this. So on the top here, you have the LiDAR spin as it captured the scene colored with the camera pixels. On the bottom is this VIDAR scan of the scene. Practically, this is what our model estimates in terms of depth. And you can see there is a lot of really great accurate detail being captured just from a single camera image. Let's switch to behavior prediction. Behavior prediction is this great area for me, which is a workshop for representations, because it can be reduced to a supervised learning problem. Specifically, you could try to regress the future trajectory of an agent, or potentially its spatiotemporal occupancy in the form of some heat map over time. and you have all the data you have observed. If you can track the object, you have the associated futures. So what behavior prediction allows you to do is to test what are these generalizable representation and architectures. What should perception really produce? Traditionally, behavior prediction has been handled by rendering a lot of the inputs in image-based form and applying convolutional neural nets on it. And in fact, Waymo's first paper, ChauffeurNet, did exactly that. However, this is a costly process. Both in compute and memory, a map can have many channels. There is a lot of interesting semantic information in the world. Also, vehicles need to be rendered in multiple frames. This is suboptimal. Furthermore, there's quantization artifacts in the map, where you need to now reduce potentially continuous signals to pixels. And last but not least, convolutional neural nets are not ideally suited to capturing long-range interactions. Typically, the networks have small kernels, convolution kernels, for efficiency. However, those cannot capture the interaction of two vehicles approaching each other from long distance, however quickly. In a paper called VectorNet from this year's CVPR, we explored a different representation, which is a vector representation, not the raster one, for a lot of this information. In fact, for all of it. All of the input information we represented as polylines. These polylines are split into vector segments and processed by the first stage of our network, producing embeddings per polyline subgraph. Then, in a global set of steps, we pass information via GNN, or in other words, transformer in this case, obtaining the final prediction for each node. What are we training for? Well, first of all, for the actor of interest that we're predicting for, we're training L1 loss on a future trajectory. And then we take a page out of the transformer playbook. And for other primitives, we can mask out at random their underlying geometry and ask the network to reconstruct it. And that does help a little bit with the quality as well. And so maybe it's not terribly surprising that encoding structure more accurately and explicitly does help, both in terms of accuracy, quality, compactness of model, and so on. So that is great. I think that suggests potentially that such representation might be quite helpful to be produced by perception in the first place. When you talk about behavior prediction, though, I just bypassed the whole big part of it, which is that we actually do not want to predict a single trajectory per agent. The agents can decide to do many different things, and ultimately we need to model the multiverse, the distribution of possible trajectories that these agents can take. Unfortunately, that's not so easy. These are continuous high-dimensional entities, and the possible sets of trajectories can be indeed very diverse. And so we do a method called TNT. We put a paper just this week, which shows how to perform really well on this task by leveraging the prediction output structure. And I'll tell you exactly what I mean in a second. How do you traditionally handle this trajectory prediction problem? We have a paper from last year's Coral conference called Multipath, which reduces behavior prediction to something closely resembling object detection. If you take all the trajectories of vehicles you have ever seen, it makes a figure a bit like this one on the top right, with the black little lines corresponding to such possible trajectories. We can discretize and cluster this space into a set of anchors. These are the blue anchors, and each anchor is associated with an endpoint and a trajectory. And so the task of behavior prediction then reduces to classifying which anchors are likely futures, regressing each anchor to more appropriate shape, and then regressing also uncertainty around each anchor corresponding to uncertainty about exactly how an agent is going to move. That is simple and works quite well, which is great, but it has some drawbacks. One of them is, and quite obviously so, there's a lot of anchors here, and you can of course put even more, but not all anchors are relevant in all cases. In fact, behavior of agents is highly topical and context dependent, and you do not want to necessarily always enumerate in very high definition all the possible things you could do. Also, these anchors often go off-road, and ideally you don't want to consider such things at all. Last but not least, it may be just hard to predict everything at once. Here you're predicting the distribution over the anchors, all their trajectories, and all the uncertainties with all these trajectories. How well can that really work? This motivates exploring a more hierarchical approach to dealing with the problem. One way to do this is to say, okay, let's just model where a set of possible locations that the vehicle could get to after, say, 3 seconds or 6 seconds or some interval t. These are the target candidates, which are in yellow rhombuses. So in the first stage, we just want to classify which of these target candidates are likely and regress a small correction for each of them that refines them within their local neighborhood. Given these anchors, the orange stars, targets, we then regress a single trajectory to each target in the second step. And this is an approximation because, in theory, there can be many trajectories to each target, but we find that this approximation works wonderfully in the vast majority of cases. And now that we have these full trajectories, the third step estimates more accurately their likelihoods again, and it prunes close to duplicate trajectories, yielding a small but diverse and meaningful set of behavior modes that an agent can take. This is the network instantiation of the above. You have the scene. We process the scene with vector net backbone, producing an embedding. On the bottom, we have many choices of how to sample these candidates. They do not have to be the same every time. They're map and condition specific. Given these candidates, we then score them, regress the offsets, get the targets, regress the trajectories, rescore them, produce the final set. This is a visualization, which I will not go into detail, of the 3 steps. In the stars of the targets, then we do trajectories to targets, then we resample and rescore the final set, producing, in this case, 6 trajectories for an evaluation. For vehicles, we use the reference lanes available in the map, which is beneficial. We produce likely destinations along those. And you can see that with such an approach, we're very competitive. We compare quite well to the winner of this year's Argoverse Motion Prediction Challenge, Jean. And I would say with a quite simple model of our own. And the other part that's interesting is that the comparison to multipath here, with the same backbone, so multipath here uses also VectorNet, TNT, which primarily changes the final stages of the prediction network, performs dramatically better in these metrics. For pedestrians, where reference lanes are not quite as obvious to obtain, we just produce a grid of target locations around the pedestrians with which we initialize. And that still does very well and still better than multipath. Similar results are obtained on standard data sets, such as Stanford drone dataset, where we obtain best-in-class result. I encourage you, if you want to learn more, please refer to the paper. I think one of the interesting lessons here is that structure matters even in the output, not just in the input. And I think we should think of the representations that allow us to represent and decompose even potentially the outputs in such suitable ways. Last topic I wanted to talk about a bit is one I think is important. It's 3D auto labeling. So this is not onboard scene understanding. This is offboard scene understanding. Offboard scene understanding is also very useful. It is great if you could get very highly accurate offboard 3D tracks like the ones on the right. These are actually obtained by a system we have. Why? First, because to train good 3D box models, you require currently a lot of 3D labeling effort, and it's consuming both in terms of cost and time necessary to produce useful labels. Furthermore, as we drive, we observe the behavior of all the agents in the scene. It's really nice to have very accurate poses offline for all of these agents. They enable us both to improve behavior prediction because you have great ground truth that's auto-labeled for that, but also it allows us to do imitation learning, to learn models of behavior of these agents, and you do not want perception noise to interfere with that. What helps us is that offboard quality, of course, can be much better than onboard quality. Offboard, we have fewer compute and latency constraints, And we, of course, are in the batch processing framework where we have frames from the past and the future, not just from the past, which is the online setup. So that is very powerful. And the core idea of this work is points time travel. For this red car surrounded by a circle, we can see different viewpoints over time. If we aggregate all these object points, we can estimate the object pose and dimensions very accurately and consistently. And this can be easily illustrated with an example where we keep aggregating more and more points over time for this vehicle. And even up to 4 seconds, you can see that often it's not enough as the viewpoints are correlated over time. However, eventually it becomes very obvious that the initial bounding box that you could get from a small temporal window can be quite suboptimal. And this leads to a system like this. It starts as a standard system, 3D object detector, multi-object tracker. But now that you have this, we can take all the points associated with a vehicle or a pedestrian that we're interested in, and then we apply a stage that is the one that takes all these points, aligns them, estimates the best pose and dimensions in the result. And this is a novel model we have. And these types of novel models produce state-of-the-art results. On the bottom is the best LiDAR detector submitted to the Waymo Open Dataset Challenge this year. And on the top here is our internal LiDAR detector that's based on the multi-view fusion work that we published last year in Coral, where we combine LiDAR features both from perspective and top-down view for optimal performance. However, this is using multiple frames and improved hyperparameters and data augmentation. And adding the last stage, the green box, which is the object auto-labeling, we get yet the best numbers on this data set. Of course, that last stage sees the future, so it's not entirely fair. However, it produces extremely high quality bounding boxes. And you see the same effect for tracking, where we have the state-of-the-art results on tracking, not just on LiDAR, and same is true for detection, but for any combination of sensors with this setup. Last thing I want to point out is that the effects of these models increase as you increase the quality standard. So traditionally, a lot of the algorithms evaluated at 0.7 IOU for vehicles and 0.5 for PEDs. This may be good for onboard use cases, but offboard, we want higher. For example, human raters consistency is around 0.8 or more. And so we want this as a bar of performance. And you can see that in the case of high standard labeling, the effect of these models is considerably higher. And doing a lot of these detailed high accuracy performance, both in detection land, this is our detector in the third column, and then the points time track travel is the difference between third and fourth column matters very much. I would like to encourage folks to also look at the offboard case because it is important, and I think there is still certain things that have not been tried in this domain for very high accuracy offboard perception. Again, a few times through this talk, I mentioned the Waymo Open Dataset. It's a high quality, large, diverse dataset we put together that contains camera and LiDAR data and can enable research of the kind I just described. So if you're interested in more work like this, please check it out. Thank you for your time. Please stay tuned for more research updates in upcoming conferences and open dataset updates. Thank you.
Thank you, Drago. We will continue with the paper spotlights. Okay, so we have the corresponding paper authors here, and we'll go through them in sequence first and just do a 1-minute quick spotlight presentation of their content. So starting with point contrast, unsupervised speed training for 3D point cloud understanding.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, y'all. So this is where we introduce point contrast, supervised pre-training framework for 3D point cloud understanding. This is joint work with Jiatao, Dami, Charles, Leo, and Or, and it will also be presented at the ECCV next week. So unlike 2D, where pre-training and fine-tuning has been a dominant paradigm, almost every model in 3D task is still trained from scratch. In our work, we propose an unsupervised framework that directly portraying a sparse ConvNet on large-scale scene dataset, ScanNet, with the contrastive learning framework at the point level. So with point contrast pre-training, we achieve consistent improvement over baselines across 6 different benchmarks, demonstrating that the learned representations can generalize across domains. And that's it. And just feel free to check out our paper and maybe also attending the Spotlight session next week. Thank you.
Thank you. Next one will be an exploration of embodied visual exploration. We have Santosh here in the call.
Hi, can you hear me? Great, yeah. Hi, so I'm Santosh and I'm here to present our work on exploration of embodied visual exploration. So here we consider the problem of embodied visual exploration where an agent is dropped into a 3D environment and it needs to gather useful information rapidly so that it can utilize this information to solve other downstream tasks. Existing approaches to this problem use widely varying experimental conditions, making it hard to understand which approach works well under what conditions. And so to address this issue, we introduce a benchmark that presents a consistent training and evaluation setup for exploration algorithms, which consists of 2 photorealistic 3D datasets, a state-of-the-art exploration architecture, competitive baselines, and diverse evaluation metrics. So on this benchmark, we perform a study of 4 popular exploration approaches and reveal their strengths and weaknesses. The code and pre-trained models are available. Feel free to check it out. Thank you.
Thank you. And you'd stay with us for the next one. Occupancy anticipation for efficient exploration and navigation.
Hi again. And so in this work, we've again focused on the problem of exploration, but here we look at the idea of occupancy maps. So existing map-based approaches to embodied exploration and navigation only build occupancy maps for regions in space that are directly visible to the agent. This can be a limiting factor for the exploration efficiency because if you need to accurately map the entire environment, you need to exhaustively explore each and every nook and corner of the environment. And so we propose to instead anticipate parts of the occupancy map that are not directly visible. So for example, if we enter a bedroom, we can easily predict that there's going to be some amount of floor space on the other side of the bed, even though we can't see it directly. And so by performing such intelligent anticipation, we were able to achieve state-of-the-art performances for both exploration and navigation. And our approach was the winner of the Habitat 2020 Point Nav Challenge. So please check out our GitHub repo for the code and pre-trained models. We'll also be presenting this work in ECCV next week. Thank you.
Thanks again. Next up is sound spaces, audio-visual navigation in 3D environments.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, cool. So this is Chen. So I'll be introducing our work, sound spaces, audio-visual navigation in 3D environments. So navigation is a multi-sensory experience, and as human, we often use vision, audio, touch, and smell to move around in the environment. But today's embodied agent is deaf, and we are the first one to introduce audio-visual navigation in 3D environments. So to achieve this goal, we first introduced sound spaces, an audio simulation platform which allows audio-visual navigation for 2 visually realistic 3D environments, Replica and Matterport. Our audio simulator produces realistic audio renderings based on the room geometry, materials, and sound source location. And our platform can also play varying sounds of your choice in real time by pre-computing a transfer function between locations. We also generalize a state-of-the-art RL model to accommodate audio observation. And in the experiments, we show that the audio cues can help navigation, and it can even replace for an audio target. And so for more details, please check out our project page. And this paper will also be presented next week in ECCV as a spotlight paper.
Thank you. Next up is self-supervised single view 3D reconstruction via semantic consistency with Xiaolong.
Hi, so we introduced self-supervised single view 3D reconstruction while semantic consistency In this project, our goal is to reconstruct the individual object into 3D meshes without any 3D shape annotation, camera key points, or template. Our key intuition is that no matter how the shape of an instance deforms, its semantic parts don't change. Giving an input image, we jointly predict the camera pose, texture flow, and mesh. And we also map the part segmentation maps from 2D domain to the UV space to formulate a canonical semantic UV map. We then use this canonical semantic UV map to constrain camera and shape learning. In addition, we also learn a template from scratch. For more information, please find our project page or come to our ECCV poster next Thursday. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So time for one quick Q&A. I will just relay some questions. Maybe it's easiest if we just go again from start to end for this one. So for point contrast, so this paper makes the case, right, that there is no equivalent to kind of the ImageNet pre-training concept for 3D networks yet. So many are still trained from scratch. But the problem seems to be that ImageNet might also be successful because cameras are so similar, right? In a way that between different data sets, you have a domain gap, but less of a technical gap. Whereas for 3D, you might have totally different like 3D sensing technologies, different densities, ranges, and noise patterns. So did you, in this paper, or for your experiments, did you try training on multiple data sets for point contrast? And do you think that might help to like overcome these technical gaps between data sets?
Yeah, I get your point, but actually I'm gonna have some like very different perspectives. So in 2D, a lot of things are very challenging just because you only have a 2D image. But in 3D, actually a lot of things are pretty simple because you have all the 3D information about the object. So in our case, like we only pre-train it on the ScanNet dataset, but we find it quite surprising that learned representation can be transferred to multiple datasets. I hope this can address some of your concerns. One example is, for example, if you pre-train on ScanNet, you can actually transfer to the Synthia 4D dataset, which is a completely different dataset. It's like the synthetic dataset. It's a straight view, kind of autonomous driving dataset, but still you can get some improvement there. So maybe, yeah, I agree there are some challenges, but also I think this is a kind of a blessing of 3D data we have right now.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Thanks.
For this paper, so I think in the experiments that really show like different metrics and strategies for learning agent behavior, it seems that coverage does pretty well, both in small and large environments in your paper. And it even performs better when you add noise to odometry. So it was interesting to see like the performance of different ones. Could you go so far as to like generally recommend to use this for training policies?
Yeah, and so the interesting thing that we found about coverage was that it has both strengths and weaknesses. The strength is that it accounts for the geometry of the scene. So if you have really cluttered environments, like in the Activision dataset which we used, it really helps prioritize certain viewpoints over others so that you see a lot more of the environment when you have a lot of obstacles blocking your view. But when we move on to more larger environments which are open and don't have so many obstacles, the challenge there seems to be that the most naive form of coverage, where you just see how much extra area you've seen and you reward the agent based on that, that doesn't really scale well in a lot of cases, simply because so for example, if let's say I start exploring in the center of a house, so I start exploring on one end, and once I reach the other end, I really don't get any reward signal to come back to the center and go to the other side, because once you've covered some amount of area, you can never be rewarded again. And so in these kinds of cases, we found a smoother formulation like novelty work better. And so, yeah, I guess depending on the case, I would recommend you could use either of them.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
For this paper, So a key part of it's a very, very cool approach, by the way, but a key part seems to be that the model needs to be able to kind of contrast the knowledge that comes from pure geometry, right? Because that is relatively certain, and the anticipation. So do you do anything in the model specifically to like separate them or predict uncertainty or incorporate that into the model while it's completing kind of the spatial temporal map, the spatial map?
So just to make sure I've understood correctly, so you're asking if there's a way to account for parts that are directly seen versus the parts that are not seen and anticipated.
Right. If that's
is that a different way?
Yeah. So that maybe users can also basically trade off the exploration efficiency versus the desired map completeness, because it could be that the agent over anticipates, right, and then maybe misses out on some map areas. So would that be a way to trade it off, maybe?
Yeah, sure. So that was one of the limitations that we had listed in our supplementary materials as well. So in certain cases, if the agent anticipates too far away, so for example, let's say it's walking along a wall, it might predict that the wall keeps extending for a really long time, but it might turn out that on the left, there is a door that's coming up, say 4 meters away, but then you just assume that it would be blocked, and so you don't explore that part of the environment. And so to kind of trade off between these issues, since our publication, we've come up with different ways to generate the ground truth so that we can trade off between how much we want to anticipate versus how accurate we want to be. Because especially if you look at a problem like navigation, where you need to go to a particular XY coordinate, incorrectly predicting, say, an entrance to be blocked can significantly impact your performance. So yeah, we have some hyperparameters to account for these. Yeah.
That's very interesting. Thank you. For sound spaces, one thing that is interesting is that the performance, so you have different sounds. Some of them are continuous, like music playing, right? And you have some short sounds that repeat, so they have multiple seconds of gap between the time the agent hears it. So basically, for example, when you have the ringing telephone, so the agent doesn't get direct audio guidance continuously. Whereas if you have like continuous sound, it will be able to like receive online. Do you know if your model is able to actually have that long-term memory? Are there any experiments on that?
Well, so like in all the experiments, I mean, I think, well, we need to first like make sure the concept is clear. So in all the experiment, we use continuous sound. So in every second there is sound, but like all the sound, they are periodic. For example, like we just like play 1 second sound like repeatedly for the whole episode. So in that case, the agent gets the audio observation each time step. So it doesn't, like the long-term memory here is mainly, I mean, we have a recurrent network, so I think it has some kind of ability to remember what happened before, but it's not like you have a sparse audio event, so that the agent is required to like remember some audio event that happens in the very beginning of the episode. So in our case, the audio, like the agent gets pretty dense audio signal and cues to find the target.
I see. So the intensity never really drops to 0. There will always be some sound.
Yeah, yeah.
And do you have any experiments with distractor sounds, like, I don't know, a humming fridge or noise from the environment to kind of distract the agent? Is that something you would like to look into in the future?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and a lot of people has asked me about that. So I think when we speak of distractor, right, we think of like two kind of noise. Like we can think of a microphone noise, and we can think of some other presenting objects that makes a sound. So the model itself is pretty robust to microphone noise. And in terms of other objects that make the sound, we need, so in the current work, the goal is only specified by the target, the sound of the target object. So if we have another sound, the agent cannot differentiate them. This is not what we have done in the sound spaces, but in my current project, we are bringing semantics into the space so that the agent knows what object it is looking for. So in that case, we can pass a label to the agent so that it can differentiate the target sound from the distractor sound. Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem.
And last but not least, about this paper. So as pointed out, this is a very ill-posed problem for learning, right? So it's really amazing that this works so well. In the end, though, you use SCOPS, right, which is a self-supervised part segmentation, to kind of constrain the learning problem further. I was just wondering if you have had any other ideas to solve this issue, because SCOPS itself, right, being self-supervised might not always give you perfect guidance either. So did you think of any other ways to do that learning constraint, or what are your thoughts on this?
So I think one possible way is to use correspondences in video. So basically a video clip depicts one instance in different views. So it provides multi-view information of the same instance. And if we can find the correspondences between frames, then we can use this correspondence to constrain the camera and the shape learning. Yeah, I think that's one possible way.
Makes sense. Cool, yeah, thank you very much. I think that's it for the paper session. And with that, I'll hand it over to Rahul, who's leading the panel discussion with the speakers. Thank you.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the panel discussion. I'm Rahul, and I'm delighted to introduce our panelists. We have Tom Funkhouser from Google Research and Princeton. He gave a talk earlier in the session. Xiaolong Wang from UCSD, who also gave a talk earlier today. Drago Anguelov from Waymo Research. And last but not least, Ryoo from Stony Brook and Google. We have about, I guess, 20 minutes to 25 minutes for this panel discussion. And I'd love to get the audience to also enter Q&A for our panel. So please feel free to use that. Use either the chat or the Q&A to enter questions you may have for the panelists, either specifically or as a group. One final warning, I'm using the Zoom web client and I can't see the gallery view. So please use the chat or just interrupt because I can't see you if you're not talking. So let me start out with a question for the panel. So I'm interested in gauging the panel's thoughts on where we are as a field. How close do you think you are, or we are, as in computer vision, in terms of operating in 3D dynamic scenes? What might be some favorite examples of problems or tasks that you believe are solved and near solved? Since we're kind of operating in sequence mode, let's just start with Tom, then Michael.
Sure. So clearly it depends on the task. I think that we're getting to the point where we can think about bin picking, with robot arms and maybe autonomous driving and things like that. They're, well constrained, and we're really far from robots interacting among people in indoor spaces and complicated tasks that involve passing things back and forth and all the dexterity of a human. And so I know that's a vanilla apple answer, but it really, really depends on the task. And so I think we're getting close to some of the simpler tasks in very limited environments that don't involve close interaction with people, but really far from many of the others.
Thanks. Xiaolong?
Okay. Yeah, so I agree with depending on the task. And I also think, so we have a lot of techniques on video recognition and 3D reconstructions. And then it's still, I think one thing we always want to happen is to do imitation learning from all this visual understanding. But then it seems like it's still very hard to do it in the wide video or real world video. And then like we always want to use this something data set or any video recognition data set. to help us, help robot to do imitation. But it seems like it's still a pretty hard problem so far. And then another aspect I want to talk about is actually affordances. And then it seems like it's also kind of area that people have not spent that much efforts on. So we understand the reconstruction and understand recognition of objects, but the understanding of how to use objects and the contact point, I think there are a lot of work on touching and contact right now. But then how to use it to help robots is also, I think, will be a very interesting direction. That's all.
Thanks. And Michael.
So my primary research focus has been representing or capturing temporal information, essentially visual information in time. And there are certain things I would like to mention. First of all, people have been mostly focusing on 2D in time, and they have been focusing slightly less for 3D in time, which now becomes full 4D. But people made a good amount of progress in representing 2D in time, so probably, or hopefully, this will translate to 3D in time as well. However, there are certain things which always annoy me. So when we are talking about building video representation 2D in time, the common approach or the most successful approach so far has been just stacking as many layers as possible. So if a convolutional layer, temporal convolutional layer allows you to capture 3 frames, why don't we stack 100 frames? I mean, 100 layers, 200 layers. And that actually has been the most, unfortunately, most successful approach so far. But when we start talking about 4D, the space, I mean, the representation, size of the representation increases dramatically. And also when we are talking about 4D, it is usually quite highly related to real-time, applications. And I don't know how happy people will be if our conclusion is, just stack as many layers as possible. So that is one thing I wanted to mention. Another thing I have that is relevant is that capturing long-term temporal structure always has been a challenge. Even in 2D, it has been, 2D in time, it has always been a challenge. So how to really correctly address long-term structure, capturing high-level activities, high-level behaviors would be another challenge we need to face. And finally, this is also relevant to the 2 things I mentioned so far. So assume that we are able to correctly represent the temporal structure, and do good abstraction of the video. It's good, but I mean that's just for the representation. And we actually, even if internally the representation is aware of the temporal structure and everything, we can seldom reuse it for anything else, such as making a prediction, temporal prediction. So, but we as humans, we can. I mean, if we know something about the temporal structure, we can simultaneously take advantage of it to predict the future. But in today's CNN representations, these were seldom coupled and they were seldom jointly learned. So, being able to represent, usually used for perception, is a bit distinct from being able to predict, particularly in terms of temporal structure and their representations. So these are some of the kind of immediate challenges that would be nice to address. I don't have the answer myself. I have been doing this for years, but I don't know.
Thanks. These are good perspectives. I also wanted to give the panelists a chance to comment on any of the other responses. I don't know whether there's something controversial here, but I'm curious to hear reactions as well.
I agree that the long-term temporal understanding of an environment, extracting a structure of it over longer periods of time, whether it's with some kind of memory banks or 3D reconstruction and the semantic kind, is a very interesting area, going beyond a few frames or spins and potentially underexplored. And I think the higher fidelity tasks you want to do, including things like realistic sensor simulation and all these behaviors, you eventually venture in this domain. And so I liked that, Mr. Ryoo mentioned this. I think it is definitely the case.
And yeah, oops, sorry, just to say it once more, I mean, without spending tremendous amount of memory and computation by stacking like 200, 300 layers. If we can do it without doing that, that would be great.
I'm not sure if it worked that well though either, right? I think it would be great. Actually, if you just stack them and it worked, we're done. There's no problem with it per se. The problem is often it doesn't work that great, right?
I think the potential for learning these long-range behaviors and long-term interactions is much greater in 3D than it would be from video and 2D. For example, in your self-driving scenario, you detect the objects, and now you have this representation where you're trying to predict where the cars go as a function of time. If you hadn't gotten the 3D structure of what a car is and understood that this cluster of points is moving as a function of time like a car does, then it would be very hard to do that task just in the abstract. And that's what people have to do for pixels. And like the means of motion you can have in 3D, like especially in autonomous driving, are very, very constrained compared to how pixels can move. Anyway, so I think there's great potential for learning over time and predicting long-range things in 3D compared to 2D.
I fully agree with that too, actually. I think you compare this work on learn to predict video, right? And trying to couple it with action models. It maybe is the right perfect representation for games like Atari, which are inherently 2D. But in our 3D robotics domain, I think methods such as the one Anelia and her brain team at Google is developing, and a lot of these more 3D, maybe over complete representations with all the constraints, trying to elicit and model that, I think will always outperform the pure 2D approach.
Let's push on that a little bit then. So I mean, considering kind of in the temporal dimension, you can imagine that there's different scales of interest, right? And some of your tasks you're looking at predicting just a few seconds in the future, but there's also temporal understanding that happens variations over a day or a season, or even over a year. What's your belief in terms of kind of looking at time? Do you think handling these different time scales can all be done in a kind of single unified framework, or they require radically different methods? Just chime in. I'm not going to structure the conversation.
Yeah, so I'm curious, like, I think when people talk about long-term, they are doing long-term, their interpretation on long-term is very different. If you are working video classification, it seems like 100 frames is long-term for you. But if you're actually doing some sort of like a lot of reasoning, and then like Ryoo said, like spring and summer and then winter, this is also a long-term. So it's actually I think it's actually very, very different. And then when we do predictions, when we train model-based models, we are also looking into maybe 10 frames and 20 frames. That's already long-term for model-based RL. So yeah, so I'm not sure if there should be a unified framework of doing all this. Yeah, so even like Tom and Drago and Michael communicating on this long-term thing, I'm not sure whether you guys are talking about the same long-term.
Yes. Thank you for clarifying, Xiaolong. Sorry, Thomas, for interruption.
That's okay.
One more thing I would like to kind of mention. So when I was talking to clarify, it usually meant for video classification, thousands of frames. Hundreds of frames, they are, not really long term, but I was kind of thinking about several, tens of seconds or minutes of videos. And one immediate question I would like to raise based on, the Xiaolong's comment is whether constraining or disguising representations would be beneficial, particularly when we want to capture long-term information or not. And I would like to, know other panelists' opinion, whether we just want to have some latent representation without any constraint, or whether we want to add some semantic constraints to the representation and discretizing them would be beneficial or not.
Well, I don't have the definitive answer to that, but what I was going to say before was that in any of these tasks, you'd like to have an underlying representation that from which you can aggregate all your observations and reason about how they're related to each other across time. And like if it's a static 3D, it's kind of straightforward that maybe you could assign things with 3D positions in space. But if it's a dynamic environment and so on and so forth, then it's much more complicated. What is that underlying representation that all observations should be locked onto and you do your reasoning on? And you're asking, should that be a first detect objects and then understand how they move and everything else? I don't know. I don't think anyone knows the definitive answer. I mean, in certain domains, that's easier than others. In self-driving cars, for example, that's easier. But in others, like if you have animals in a zoo or something, I don't know, maybe that's not as easy. Maybe it is. I don't know. Anyway,
it's harder to find the exact parameterizations for some of these creatures like animals. But of course, then you're faced with understanding people behavior. And if you go to extreme, it starts reducing to roughly the same thing, right? People incredibly complex articulated objects interact with a bunch of other objects, right? And so at that level, I think all of our, except maybe in self-driving, you don't always have to understand everything at a completely high fidelity way to necessarily drive safely, right? Which is a good thing.
Yeah, actually,
rather than pressing every aspect of the pedestrian in rich detail. Go ahead, Xiaolong.
Yeah, you can learn to model it very accurately in 3D fully and potentially learn to anticipate it that way, but it's not clear to what fidelity that is really sufficient or necessary, right? I think at some point, you maybe don't want to model every pixel in the environment, right? It's not that relevant for successful progress. And finding the sweet spot of which intuitions get you to the right representation. I think in our domain, it's a bit easier to reason about what may be the right representation. It's a little bit structured, and some of these things come out. I expect very similar intuitions will generally carry for similar robotics domains, just potentially a little bit more 3D. But I would be surprised if they're qualitatively different than the kind of pipelines I talked about.
Yeah, I actually completely agree. I feel like if our goal is to do some manipulation or apply actions and planning, maybe the explicit 3Ds, like reconstructing the exact beautiful vertices, might not be necessary. We need to have some 3D representation, and it can be an implicit kind of representation. It can be a like voxel feature representation. Doesn't have to be a full reconstruction of the scene and object. That's why I feel especially when we try to do predictions, if we want to predict every step, like predicting this explicit 3D for every step is just very, very difficult. Predicting the implicit things or predicting the right enough information that we need for our goal task might be just sufficient enough.
Great. Let's actually change tracks a little bit. About applications for a lot of this 4D reasoning work. So whether it's augmented reality, robotics, autonomous driving, and so on. In these ones, the sensing modalities that we use tend to be things like RGB or structured light and LiDAR. But are we using those? Are these really the right ones? Could there, I'm curious about people's thoughts on, are there better or other sensing modalities that we should be considering for 4D scene understanding? I know that people are considering things like radar, audio, maybe even event cameras and other exotic sensors. So what's the role of sensors, do you believe, in this field for us?
I can say a few things about sensors.
Yeah.
Generally, a combination of LiDAR and camera is very powerful for advancing the state of the art in both, I find. And they're very nicely complementary, and in a good sensor setup can be used to co-train in very interesting ways.
Cross-modal supervision from LiDAR and vision.
And I think a setup that has camera and LiDAR can produce better camera or LiDAR models if you should so choose by a big margin. So it's nice to have some 3D sensor to ground you, as opposed to trying to self-supervise your full way. I keep seeing in the academia this tendency to try to wring as much out of limited setup. And ideally, I mean, I don't see an issue. It helps to give yourself a crutch when possible. I think temporal supervision is such an example. It's a strong supervisory signal because there's a lot of structure to the environment. But shape simplicity or some of those things are less so, right? When you have more disparate collections of some objects that people thought were the same. So I really think potentially at the very least, people should do a lot more things with video collections of various instances of a class as opposed to specific images. One thing I would say about radar is it's a very powerful sensor tool and very complementary to cameras. It is strong exactly in the areas that the camera is weakest, which is direct measurement of velocity, accurate depth estimate. Ultimately, these are the estimates that camera, they're second order citizens somehow in the camera world. And so it's not as easy to get. And of course, performance in bad weather and performance at night and all things like this. One of the difficulties with the radar that you have out there is that they're really good planar sensors. And there is even now some proper radars that have some good vertical resolution, but those are relatively few. And so it poses some constraints to what you can do with the setups. I think in indoors might be a different story. I'm not so familiar, but that's why a lot of the work is easier to do in camera and LiDAR first, even though radar by itself is very powerful. When you see something big metal thing moving towards you, you know what to do, right? And that's very simple.
Other perspective?
I think probably like, for example, tactile sensors and then touch sensors. They're actually quite a lot, not a lot, but they're already starting some recent work on using touch and tactile to help reconstruction, 3D reconstruction. And then I think especially in the area of dexterous manipulation, like in-hand manipulation, it seems like the touch sensor can really be very useful on like first understand the object and to actually do very fine-grained kinds of manipulation. It would be very interesting to look into those information, not just supervision, but also, yeah, a modality to use. Yeah.
So, I mean, just echoing everybody, I mean, two aspects when we are talking about multimodality. One, training, usually self-supervised learning, and two, inference, or actually how to take advantage of multimodality. And I agree that, you know, using multiple different types of inputs is beneficial for both. As long as them, I mean, for example, when we want to take advantage of different types of inputs, we should learn how to take advantage of it. It shouldn't be like hand design architecture, but we should optimize the architecture itself to best take advantage of different modalities. And as long as that's happening, I think it will always be beneficial. And in terms of self-supervised learning with different modalities, what Drago actually pointed out matches with previous experiments, which was not done with LiDAR, which was done purely with like, you know, RGB frames and audio. But cross-modality self-supervised tasks were greatly beneficial, improving representation of just RGB representation in the end. So in that context, I actually have a question for Drago. So assume that we have like LiDAR and camera and everything for training. But we want to make the RGB, the camera, one of the cheapest sensors, the model to only rely on that for the inference. So for the training, we have everything, but for the inference, we only have a camera.
Right.
Do you think there's how good can a camera do? Will a camera be sufficient, or will we eventually need other types of sensors?
I think
and
there's
maybe
a good...
same line, Drago. But there is a question from the audience along sensors, and you're probably the right person to take this as well, which is you can imagine upgrading road environments to aid autonomous driving rather than just doing everything inside the vehicle. That was true even back in the early 90s when I was working in this area. So what are your thoughts around kind of smart traffic lights, localization beacons, and other things as kind of infrastructure sensors, you know, in addition to thinking kind of beyond cameras?
Okay, so I see this interesting trend through my involvement in self-driving. I think if you asked me 2 years ago, how good are really cameras for as a perception sensor, and I would say there is no way, right? I think today the answer is we don't know. The fact that we can show some good results, and including me myself today, it does not mean yet that it is robust enough to the levels required for driving. I think this will be developing as we go. The quality is still improving. There is this interesting paradigm that cameras and LiDAR are moving towards each other. Camera performance keeps improving in terms of 3D possibilities. LiDAR also keeps improving and becoming cheaper. So you start LiDARs that look more and more like cameras, and cameras that look more and more like LiDARs. And how these two are gonna meet, I don't know, but I think there's some good convergence happening on some level. I'm skeptical that just with the camera, in all the conditions, it would be sufficient. Of course, you have the proof of the human with eyes, and so it's in theory possible, but there is still the question of at what point are you confident in that safety, and don't you want to complement with some sensors that are active for the corner cases, which you're not going to see much. And currently, machine learning, as we know it, this is one of the areas it's not very good at compared to humans, right? A lot of it comes to these generalizable representations, which we may need to develop still in progress for that to be the case. But I'm yet to see proof that purely a passive sensor with current machine learning technology is sufficient. It's a big question for the community.
Thanks. So let's see, we are running out of time. So I actually do want to go through each of the panelists and kind of ask you to give your opinion. So if you could pick one grand challenge that you think will really drive this field forward, what would it be? I can guess for some of you, but let's actually just hear it out loud. So Tom.
Good. Just because we've been talking about it, I'll pick the thing that comes first to my mind, which is what is the underlying representation of space-time? And then so if we had a good substrate, then all observations could be tied to, and so therefore learning's relatively easy, then that would be it. And I don't think we know what it is. There's recent work in 3D shape representation around implicit functions. So instead of like saying at this 3D point, it's a chair, it's rather the network is not producing a 3D output. It's that you can give it an XYZ, and then it's telling you, are you inside, outside, or are you, what's the sign distance to the closest function? So the output is a function, not an explicit representation. Whether and that's had huge effect on 3D shape representation. So could that work for 4D? I don't know. Anyway, I think that we will come up with ways to understand how to represent dynamic objects such that the functions that have to be learned are less complicated and easier to learn.
Thank you. Yep, that makes sense. Xiaolong?
I think I would say it's like supervision. So I know that we keep talking about using self-supervised learning and self-supervision, and then how to actually use it. So we are still using it mostly in training phase. So like the work I presented, I think we're recently phase as well. So how to enable learning during test times, and then how to continuously update the model online. And then I think that will be very useful, especially there should not be a universal model for all the devices. Maybe there can be very specific model that online updated just for that one device or just for a specific subject. So maybe if we can look into not just generalization, but actually self-supervised learning with only few labels, only few examples, or just a specific subject with examples, and then we can actually do very, very well on that specific subject on device. Yeah, That's
Cool.
something.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Drago?
Just would have a comment that once the system starts learning in the real world, the safety analysis becomes very interesting. So that's yet another problem that one needs to think very carefully about. I would say that to me, there is this like grand challenge when I think of autonomous driving as a machine learning person. So it doesn't have to happen from nothing, the knowledge, right? But if you have a system, ideally, as it drives in the world, it should just improve all around. And the longer it drove, the more it should just improve, right? And I think of a system that would have these properties. And this is true for many of these systems that you guys talked about, or it was talked in 4th division. I think serve a purpose. There's big question still. We need to tie the planning, and a lot of you have tied it. I did not talk about an R&D yet about the planning side. I think either there is one generic type of spatial temporal representation that's just helpful in navigating 3D environments that now the idea should generalize to many domains, or even if it's a specific domain, then we need to analyze it with a specific tasks in mind. But ideally, you want to build one that even if you prime it significantly, and even if you pre-train it on a bunch of, say, as I talked about these modular outputs, you can pre-train yourself all your outputs. When you release it, ideally, it will have the property that by and large it should just improve. And maybe you can even put some limited human advisorship in the form of active training and labeling in the loop if you have to. But is that, with that constraint, can we do it? I think that those will be systems that truly scale eventually. And I think so that's one. And the other part, I think, to really enable that, it's really helpful to build systems that are aware of their own uncertainty. Right? So estimating well uncertainty in open-ended environments is always a big topic. And I think there is a lot of interesting work nowadays, but I think that's an area where more is needed, because that cultural ability to evolve this system. If you do not have a good measure of uncertainty, you cannot even deploy it safely.
Agreed. And Michael.
Mm-hmm. So we already talked about long-term temporal information and multi-input fusion, so for learning. So I will not mention about that. One thing I'm personally very curious about is the mismatch between the training and inference distribution. I mean, which is a common problem in any machine learning problem. But I would be very curious whether this 4D data, 4D vision actually helps or damages in terms of this distribution mismatch. I mean, maybe 4D, being 3D naturally makes the distribution. I don't know. I don't know much about 3D, so maybe I'm making a wrong argument. But being 3D means that there is a higher chance that you can make your distribution more similar than just playing with pixels. So maybe 4D is also beneficial in that aspect. But I don't have any experiments. I don't have any big insight or intuition how things will look like. So this is something I am kind of curious about.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. Yeah, so we have reached the end of the panel. I did want people's kind of informed hypotheses, so that's totally that makes a lot of sense. So thank you again to the panelists, Funkhouser, Xiaolong Wang, Drago Anguelov, and Michael Ryoo. Thank you also to the speakers from both the sessions. Really enjoyed the talks. Reminder that the papers and longer presentations are all available on the workshop website. So the authors took a lot of time to kind of make these longer presentations. Please go and check them out. And I'm really grateful to my co-organizers for the workshop. Anelia, who did a lot of the heavy lifting behind this workshop, Vincent, Jürgen, and Noah Snavely. Thank you for those of you who attended both of these sessions in these kind of temporally dislocated format. And I know it's super hard to be both a panelist, a speaker in this virtual format, as well as an attendee. So I appreciate everyone's attention through the day, and look forward to catching all of you in person, maybe after the pandemic. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.